The cathedral was too quiet. That's the first thing you notice when something's about to go wrong. Not the silence itself, but the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, the kind that makes you hold your breath without meaning to. St. Augustine's Cathedral in Menlo Park doesn't usually feel small. High ceilings, stained glass that catches the California sun just right, rows of polished wood pews that have held decades of weddings, baptisms, and goodbyes. But today it felt like a cage. Outside, black Mercedes and Teslas lined the street. Inside, 300 people sat in designer suits and dresses that cost more than most people make in a month. Venture capitalists, tech executives, real estate moguls, lawyers who billed by the minute. Everyone who mattered was here, or at least everyone who thought they mattered. Rob Walton's casket sat at the front of the cathedral, polished mahogany, gold handles, fresh white lilies arranged perfectly on top, the kind of casket that whispers legacy without saying a word. But before we dive in, don't just watch. Please hit the subscribe button. I'm still fighting my way to our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single click truly keeps this channel alive. And tell me in the comment where in the world you are watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating more emotional stories of resilience, healing, and kindness. 3 days ago, Rob Walton, billionaire real estate developer, Silicon Valley power player, the man who built half of the Bay Area's skyline, collapsed in his home office. Sudden cardiac arrest, they said. Gone before the ambulance arrived. No warning, no goodbyes, just gone. That's what everyone believed. George Yass sat in the front pew, shoulders straight, hands folded in his lap. 32 years old, freshly promoted to CEO of Walton Holdings. Tailored black Tom Ford suit, a Rolex that didn't scream, it whispered. He looked like grief wrapped in control. His jaw was tight, his eyes were dry. He stared at the casket like a man who'd already made peace with loss. But if you looked close, really close, you'd see something else. Relief. The priest was halfway through Psalm 23. His voice rolled through the cathedral like a lullaby. Soft, safe, final. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. People bowed their heads. A few wiped tears. Others checked their phones under the pews. This was the last chapter, the end of the story. The moment where everyone goes home and moves on. Except, a woman stood up. Not in the front, not in the middle, but toward the back, where the staff sat, where the people who worked for Rob Walton were allowed to mourn quietly, invisibly, out of the way. Her name was Bianca. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no makeup that you'd notice. Her hands were shaking. She didn't look like someone who interrupts a billionaire's funeral. She looked like someone who cleans up after one. For 12 years, Bianca had been part of the furniture in Rob Walton's life. The woman who brought his Earl Grey tea every morning at exactly 6:40. The woman who knew which rooms he avoided when he was stressed. The woman who could tell his mood by the way he left his coffee cup on the desk. She wasn't family. She wasn't in the will. She was just there. Until now. Bianca took one step into the aisle, then another. Heads turned. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave you can't stop. The priest paused. His eyes flicked up from the Bible, confused. George turned in his seat. His face shifted, not worried, just irritated, like someone had knocked over a glass of water at a dinner party. He leaned toward the man beside him, voice low and sharp. Get her out of here. But Bianca didn't stop walking. She moved past the rows of tailored suits and tasteful grief, past the people who'd known Rob Walton as a contact in their phone, past the investors who showed up because it was good for business. Her eyes stayed on the casket. No, not the casket, on George. She stopped 10 feet from the altar, close enough that everyone could see her face, close enough that no one could ignore her. Her voice cracked when she spoke. But it didn't break. He's not dead. 3 words. That's all it took. Gasps cut through the silence. A woman in the 3rd row clutched her pearls not as a joke, but because shock makes you grab onto something real. Someone laughed, nervous, unsure. The priest froze, one hand still raised mid-blessing. George stood, fast. His chair scraped against the marble floor, loud enough to make people flinch. This is completely inappropriate, he said. His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes weren't. She's confused. She's grieving. Someone needs to. No. Bianca shook her head. Slow. Steady. I'm not confused. She took another step forward. 2 security guards in black suits moved from the side of the room, hands already reaching for her arms. But something stopped them. Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was the way she didn't look away. Bianca placed her hand on the casket. Her fingers trembled against the wood. "He has locked-in syndrome," she said. His heart didn't fail. His body did. The cathedral went dead silent. Not the kind of silence from before. This was different. This was the kind of silence that comes right before everything falls apart. George laughed. Sharp, cold. "That's absurd," he said. "Doctors confirmed his death. This is—" Bianca turned to face the crowd. Her eyes swept across every face. Every phone now lifted and recording. Every person who thought they knew how this day would end. Because they were told not to look closer. Let me tell you something about being invisible. It's not about being ignored. It's about being useful enough to keep around, but forgettable enough that people talk like you're not even there. That was Bianca's life. For 12 years, she wasn't Rob Walton's assistant. She wasn't his confidant. She wasn't someone he introduced at parties or mentioned in interviews. She was the maid. The woman who cleaned the glass doors in his Bay Area estate so they didn't streak. The woman who restocked the coffee beans he liked, the expensive ones from that little roaster in Oakland. The woman who knew he hated when people moved the books on his desk, even to dust them. Bianca learned early that her job wasn't just to clean, it was to disappear. Every morning, she arrived at 6:30. She brewed the tea. She set it on the corner of his desk at exactly 6:40, right next to his reading glasses and the Wall Street Journal he still preferred in print. Rob would nod. Sometimes he'd say thank you. Most days, he wouldn't say anything at all. And that was fine, because Bianca understood something most people don't. The help isn't supposed to have opinions, or feelings, or thoughts that matter. You smile. You work. You leave. She was good at it, maybe too good. Because over 12 years, Bianca started to notice things no one else did. Like how Rob's left hand shook when he was anxious just slightly, like a tremor he tried to hide. Like how he'd stare out the window for 10 minutes at a time on the mornings after George visited. Like how he kept a small notebook in his desk drawer that he never let anyone touch, not even his son. Bianca didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She just saw. And Rob Walton? He saw her too. Not at first. Not for years. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. He started asking how her daughter was doing in school. He remembered her name Maya even though Bianca had only mentioned it once. When Bianca's car broke down last winter, Rob told her to use one of the estate vehicles, not as a loan, just use it. He didn't make a big deal out of it. When her mother got sick, he quietly paid the hospital bills. No announcement, no contract. He just did it. Bianca never asked why. She just knew that Rob Walton wasn't like his son. George had been in and out of that house 100 times over the years. He never looked at Bianca, not once, not to say hello, not to acknowledge she existed. To him, she was part of the walls. And maybe that's why Rob trusted her. Because she was the one person in his life who didn't want anything from him. The night before Rob collapsed, Bianca was cleaning his office. He was still at his desk, working late like always. He looked up, tired, older than usual. "Bianca?" She stopped, surprised. He almost never spoke to her this late. "Yes, Mr. Walton?" He stared at her for a moment, like he was deciding whether to say something. Then he nodded. "Thank you. For everything." She didn't know what he meant. Not then. But 3 days later, standing in that cathedral with every eye on her, and a room full of people who thought she'd lost her mind, she understood. Rob Walton had trusted her with his life, and now she was the only one willing to fight for it. Sometimes the people society overlooks are the only ones brave enough to speak up. And if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether your voice matters, then you already know why this story matters too. Because courage doesn't come from power. 3 weeks before the funeral, Bianca arrived at the Walton estate at 6:30 a.m., same as always. The fog was thick that morning, the kind that turns everything grey and makes the mansion look like it's floating. She unlocked the side entrance with her key, the one Rob had given her years ago, the one George didn't know existed, and headed straight for the kitchen. Earl Grey, 2 minutes steep, no sugar, a slice of lemon on the side. By 6:40, she was walking down the hallway toward Rob's study, tea tray balanced in her hands. The door was open. That was the first sign something was wrong. Rob never left his study door open when he was working. Bianca slowed. She could hear something inside. A sound like breathing, but wrong, labored, desperate. She pushed the door wider. Rob Walton was on the floor, face down, one arm stretched out like he'd tried to catch himself, papers scattered everywhere, his phone just out of reach. "Mr. Walton." Bianca dropped the tray. Tea spilled across the hardwood, but she didn't care. She was already on her knees beside him, hands shaking as she reached for his wrist. Pulse, faint, but there. She grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, just stay with me." His eyes were half open, staring, unblinking. But then, just for a second, they moved. They followed her. It was so quick, she almost missed it. A flicker, a shift, like someone trapped behind glass, trying to signal. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They swarmed the study, checked vitals, asked questions Bianca tried to answer through the panic tightening her throat. "Has he been sick?" "No." "Any history of heart problems?" I don't know. I don't think so." They loaded him onto a stretcher. Bianca followed them out to the ambulance, her hands still trembling. "His eyes," she said to one of the paramedics. I think he was trying to look at me." The paramedic glanced at her, kind but dismissive. "Ma'am, that's just a reflex sometimes. The body does things we don't understand. But we're taking him to Stanford Medical. You can follow if you want." She did. At the hospital, Bianca sat in the waiting room for 2 hours. No updates. No one would tell her anything. Then George arrived. She knew it was him before she even saw him. The way the nurses straightened, the way the energy in the room shifted, the way people suddenly moved faster. George Yass walked through the emergency room doors like he owned the place. Expensive coat, expensive shoes, expensive indifference. He didn't look at Bianca. He walked straight past her to the nurses' station. "I'm George Yass, Rob Walton's son. Where is he?" Within minutes, everything changed. Doctors appeared. Conversations happened behind closed doors. George made phone calls, lots of them. Bianca caught pieces. Legal terms, medical directives, something about not pursuing aggressive intervention. She tried to approach him once. "Mr. Yass, I was there when he collapsed." "I think." George turned. His eyes landed on her for half a second. "Thank you," he said, flat, polite, final. "We'll handle it from here." Then he walked away. 2 hours later, a doctor came out. Not to Bianca, to George. She couldn't hear what they said, but she saw George nod, saw him sign something on a clipboard, saw him shake the doctor's hand. Then he left. He didn't stop, didn't look back, just walked out of the hospital like he'd finished a business meeting. Bianca sat, frozen in her chair. 30 minutes later, a nurse approached her. "Ma'am, Mr. Walton passed away." "I'm sorry." The words didn't make sense. "But he was alive. I saw him." His eyes. "I'm sorry," the nurse repeated, softer this time. "There's nothing more we can do." Bianca walked out of that hospital knowing one thing. Something was very, very wrong. Bianca didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment in Daly City, staring at the wall, replaying everything in her mind. Rob's eyes, the way they'd moved, the way George had shown up, and everything just stopped. The way no one asked questions, the way no one looked closer. By sunrise, Bianca knew what she had to do. She drove back to the Walton estate. She still had her key. Technically, she was still employed. No one had fired her yet. No one had even called. The house was empty, silent. She walked through the hallways she'd cleaned 1,000 times, but today they felt different, heavier, like the walls were holding secrets. Bianca went straight to Rob's study. The tea stain was still on the floor. No one had cleaned it. She stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he'd fallen, where his hand had reached out, where everything had changed. Then she did what she always did. She started cleaning. Not because she had to, because it was the only thing that made sense. She wiped down his desk, straightened the papers, picked up the books that had been knocked over, and that's when she saw it. A leather folder, tucked under a stack of financial reports. The kind of folder you'd miss unless you were looking for it, or unless you knew Rob well enough to notice when something was out of place. Bianca hesitated. This wasn't her business. She was the maid. She cleaned. She left. But her hands were already reaching for it. Inside the folder was a single piece of paper, handwritten, recent. The ink still dark. The handwriting was shaky, like someone had written it in a hurry, or in pain. It said, "If anything happens to me, it's George. Trust Bianca." Her breath caught. She read it again, and again. Rob Walton had written her name. Not his lawyers, not his business partners, Not anyone with power or money or influence. Her. Bianca's hands started shaking so hard she almost dropped the paper. Why would he write this? When had he written this? And what did he know? She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Her heart was racing. Her mind was spinning. If George found out she had this? No. She couldn't think about that. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were still trembling, but she forced them steady. She went back to the spot where Rob had collapsed. She stood there, imagining him on the floor, imagining his eyes trying to tell her something. And then she did something she couldn't explain. She knelt down. She held up her phone, and she spoke. "Mr. Walton, if you can hear me." Blink once for yes, twice for no. Silence. Nothing. She felt ridiculous. He wasn't here. He was gone. Dead. Declared. Signed off. But then she remembered. His eyes. The way they'd moved. The way they'd followed her. Bianca stood up. She walked to the doorway. She held up her phone again, this time recording. "Mr. Walton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you still in there?" She played it back. On the tiny screen, you could see the edge of the room, the papers on the floor, the empty space where Rob had been. But if you looked close, if you knew what you were looking for, you could see it. The faintest movement in his eyes. One blink. Bianca replayed it 5 times. Then 10. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining it. Rob Walton had been alive, and George had made sure no one knew. Bianca sat on the floor of that study, the note in one hand and her phone in the other, and made a choice. She was a black woman with no money, no status, no voice that anyone would listen to. But she had the truth, and sometimes that's the only weapon you need. She stood up. She walked out of that house, and she started planning how to stop a funeral. Back in the cathedral, Bianca stood facing 300 people who thought she'd lost her mind. George's voice cut through the whispers. "This woman is clearly unwell," he said. Calm, reasonable, the voice of someone in control. "My father's death has been difficult for all of us, but making accusations, I have proof." Bianca's voice was louder this time. She reached into her purse. George's face changed. Just for a second, a flash of something that wasn't grief. Fear. Bianca pulled out her phone. "Before the ambulance came," she said, "I recorded him." The crowd leaned forward. Every phone in the room was up now, filming. This wasn't a funeral anymore. It was something else. Bianca's hands shook as she held up her phone. The screen was small, but the cathedral had gone so quiet you could hear her breath. She pressed play. On the screen, Rob Walton. Motionless on the floor of his study, eyes half open, face slack. Then Bianca's voice shaking. "Mr. Walton, are you still in there?" A pause. Then his eyes. They moved. One blink. Clear, deliberate, unmistakable. Someone in the crowd gasped. "That doesn't prove anything," George said quickly. Too quickly. "That could be edited. That could be locked-in syndrome," Bianca interrupted. She turned to face the crowd. "It's a condition where the body shuts down, but the mind stays awake. You can't move, you can't speak, but you're conscious. You're there." A murmur rolled through the cathedral. "It mimics death," Bianca continued. "The heartbeat slows, the breathing becomes shallow. Doctors miss it all the time, especially if they're not looking for it." She turned back to George. "Especially if someone tells them not to look." George stepped forward. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched. "You're accusing me of what exactly? Lying? Murdering my own father?" "I'm saying you knew." The words hung in the air. George laughed. "But it wasn't convincing anymore. This is absurd. My father was examined by medical professionals. He was declared dead by a doctor you hired," Bianca said. The crowd erupted. Phones flashed. People stood. Voices overlapped in shock and confusion. The priest stepped back, hands raised like he didn't know whose side to take. One of the security guards moved toward Bianca, but an older woman in the third row, someone's grandmother, dressed in pearls and dignity, stood up. "Let her speak." Other voices joined in. "Show the video again." "Is that real?" Someone called the police. George's composure was cracking. His face was red now, his voice rising. "My father is dead. This is a sick attempt to..." "To what?" Bianca shot back. "To save his life." She took a step closer to George, close enough that he had to look her in the eye. "You rushed everything," she said. "No autopsy, no second opinion. The funeral planned within 48 hours. You didn't even let anyone say goodbye." George's mouth opened, then closed. And the board meeting, Bianca continued. The one scheduled for next week. The one where your father was planning to remove you as CEO. The cathedral went silent. George froze. How do you? Because he told me. Bianca reached into her purse again. This time, she pulled out the note. She unfolded it carefully. Her hands were steadier now. She read it aloud. If anything happens to me, it's George. Trust Bianca. Her voice cracked on the last word. He wrote this 3 days before he collapsed. He knew something was going to happen, and he knew who was behind it. George's face went pale. For the first time, he had nothing to say. A man in a suit stood up in the back row. I'm calling 911. Another voice. We need to stop this burial. Someone else. Open the casket. George turned, frantic now. You can't, this is a desecration. But it was too late. A woman near the front, sharp-eyed, lawyer written all over her, pulled out her phone. I'm filing an emergency injunction. No one touches that casket until a medical examiner arrives. The priest stepped forward. His voice was shaking, but firm. We will not proceed with the burial until this is resolved. George looked around the room, at the faces that had once respected him, at the phones recording his every move, at the crowd that was no longer on his side. His eyes landed on Bianca. She didn't look away. You had everything, she said quietly, and it still wasn't enough. George said nothing. 2 police officers appeared at the cathedral doors. Someone must have called ahead. They approached George. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. George stood frozen for a moment. Then slowly, he straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, like he could still control this, like he was still in charge. But when the officers led him down the aisle, past the rows of people who'd once wanted his favor, no one moved to help him. Bianca watched him go. Then she turned back to the casket. Her hand rested on the polished wood. Hold on, Mr. Walton, she whispered. Just a little longer. And if you've ever wondered whether one voice can change everything, whether standing up matters when the whole world tells you to sit down, then you already know why some stories need to be told. Because the truth doesn't care how small you are. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. The casket was loaded into an ambulance at 2:47 p.m. Not a hearse. An ambulance, because Rob Walton might still be alive. Bianca stood on the cathedral steps, watching the vehicle pull away, lights flashing but no siren. The crowd had spilled out onto the street. Some people were crying, others were on their phones, already spreading the story. A reporter had somehow appeared with a camera crew. This was no longer a private funeral. This was national news waiting to happen. Bianca's legs felt weak. She sat down on the steps, her phone clutched in her hand. A woman approached. Mid-50s. Expensive coat. The kind of face that looked like it gave orders, not took them. You did the right thing, the woman said. Bianca looked up. Did I? My husband died 2 years ago, the woman continued. Sudden stroke. They declared him brain dead within 3 hours. Told me to let him go. She paused. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't fight hard enough. Her voice cracked. You fought. That matters. She walked away before Bianca could respond. A police officer approached next. Young, nervous. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come to Stanford Medical Center. They'll want your statement. And the video. Bianca nodded. She didn't trust her voice. The ride to the hospital took 23 minutes. It felt like 6 hours. Bianca sat in the back of a police car, not arrested, just transported, staring out the window at the Bay Area streets blurring past. What if she was wrong? What if the video was just a reflex, like the paramedic said? What if she'd just destroyed a man's funeral, humiliated his family, and Rob Walton was actually... No, she couldn't think like that. She'd seen his eyes. She'd read his note. She knew. At Stanford Medical Center, chaos. News vans were already parked outside. Security was trying to set up barriers. Hospital administrators were shouting into phones. Bianca was escorted through a side entrance, away from the cameras. A doctor met her in a private waiting room. Older man, white coat, tired eyes that had seen too much. I'm Dr. Patel, he said, Chief of Neurology. We're examining Mr. Walton now. Is he? We don't know yet. But I need to understand what you saw. Bianca showed him the video. Explained everything. The collapse, the hospital, George's arrival, the way the tests just stopped. Doctor? Patel's face grew darker with each detail. Locked-in syndrome is rare, he said, but it happens. And yes, it can be mistaken for death, especially if the examination is rushed. How long until you know? We're running a full neurological workup, EEG, MRI, response tests. If he's conscious. Dr. Patel paused. We'll know within 6 hours. 6 hours. Bianca sat in that waiting room, alone, while the world spun outside. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts from people she barely knew, calls from numbers she didn't recognize, a voicemail from a producer at CNN. She ignored all of it. At 5:15 p.m., a nurse brought her coffee. She didn't drink it. At 6:30 p.m., a lawyer appeared, introduced himself as representing the Walton estate, asked her not to speak to the media. She didn't respond. At 8 p.m., the waiting room door opened. Dr. Patel stood there. His face was unreadable. Bianca stood. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. We need to run more tests, Dr. Patel said. But preliminary results show. He stopped, took a breath. Mr. Walton is exhibiting brain activity consistent with consciousness. The room tilted. He's alive? Doctor. Patel nodded slowly. He's alive. Bianca's knees gave out. She didn't faint. She just collapsed, folded onto the floor like someone had cut her strings. The nurse rushed over. Ma'am, are you okay? But Bianca wasn't crying from relief. She was crying because she'd been right, and that meant Rob Walton had been trapped, aware, conscious, for 3 entire days. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to scream, knowing his own son was burying him alive. Dr. Patel knelt beside her. You saved his life, he said quietly. Bianca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I almost didn't. George Yass was arrested at 9:47 p.m. that same night. Not at his father's estate, at the Four Seasons in Palo Alto, where he'd checked in under a fake name 3 hours after the funeral was stopped. He didn't run far. Maybe he didn't think he needed to. The charges came fast. Attempted murder, fraud, filing false medical documents, bribery. But the real story, the one that came out over the next 72 hours, was worse than anyone imagined. Investigators found everything. The altered medical directive George had filed 2 weeks before Rob's collapse. The one that said, do not resuscitate and comfort care only. Rob had never signed it. The signature was forged. They found the doctor, Dr. Raymond Moss, a private physician. George had paid $200,000 to declare Rob dead without conducting a full neurological exam. Dr. Moss cooperated immediately, gave up everything. He claimed he didn't know, that he'd trusted George's account, that he thought he was just helping a grieving son avoid an invasive autopsy. No one believed him. They found the emails between George and the funeral home. Messages sent less than 2 hours after Rob was pronounced dead. Move fast. Family wants this handled quietly. They found the board meeting minutes. The vote scheduled for the week after the funeral. The motion to remove George as CEO due to financial mismanagement and ethical concerns. Rob had been planning to cut his son out of the company, not because of cruelty, because George had been bleeding Walton Holdings dry, unauthorized investments, secret loans, money disappearing into offshore accounts. Rob had spent months building the case. He'd trusted his lawyers, his board, his accountants, but he'd never told George, and George had figured it out anyway. The night before Rob collapsed, George had visited the estate. Security footage showed him leaving Rob's study at 11:43 p.m. Investigators found a half-empty bottle of prescription medication in Rob's desk drawer. Medication Rob had never been prescribed. Medication that, in high doses, could cause temporary paralysis, seizures, symptoms that looked exactly like cardiac arrest. George had poisoned his own father. Not enough to kill him, just enough to mimic death. Just enough to make everyone stop asking questions. The plan was simple. Declare him dead, bury him fast, take control of the company before anyone could object. By the time the board meeting came around, George would be the grieving son and the rightful heir. Untouchable. He almost got away with it. Almost. The media went wild. Every news outlet from CNN to the New York Times ran the story. Silicon Valley heir tried to bury father alive. Maid stops billionaire's funeral exposes shocking plot. Bianca's face was everywhere. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Producers offered her book deals, movie rights, interview exclusives. She ignored all of it. Because while the world turned George into a monster and Bianca into a hero, Rob Walton was still in a hospital bed, still trapped, still fighting, and she was the only person who seemed to remember that. 2 weeks after the funeral that never happened, George Yass stood in front of a judge, bail denied. Trial set for 6 months out. His lawyer argued diminished capacity, grief, pressure, a young man who made terrible choices under impossible circumstances. The prosecutor held up the forged medical directive. He tried to bury his father alive, she said. There's no diminished capacity defense for that. The judge agreed. George was led out in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Not at the courtroom. Not at the reporters. Not at anyone. Because when you lose everything, there's nothing left to see. Rob Walton opened his eyes fully for the first time on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral that didn't happen, 17 days after the breathing tube came out, 9 days after he started communicating through assistive technology, a computer that tracked his eye movements and translated them into words on a screen. It was slow, exhausting. Every sentence took minutes. But it was his voice. The first thing he asked for? Bianca. She'd been to the hospital twice since that first night, but both times Rob had been asleep or undergoing tests. The doctors said he needed rest, minimal visitors, no stress. But on this Tuesday morning, Dr. Patel called her himself. He's asking for you. Bianca drove to Stanford in a daze. She parked in the visitor lot and sat in her car for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel. What do you say to someone you brought back from the dead? She didn't know. A nurse met her at the neurological wing and walked her to Rob's room. Private, corner unit, windows overlooking the bay. The door was open. Rob was sitting up slightly, propped against pillows. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were sharp, alert, alive. When he saw her, something in his face changed. Bianca stepped inside. Mr. Walton. He blinked twice. No. Then his eyes moved to the screen mounted beside his bed. Slowly, letter by letter, words appeared. Just Rob. Bianca's throat tightened. She sat in the chair beside his bed, close enough to see the faint tremor still present in his left hand, close enough to notice the small scar on his temple from the IV line. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rob's eyes moved again. The computer screen lit up. You saved my life. Bianca shook her head. No, you did. More words formed. I was awake. The whole time. Bianca's breath caught. I heard them say I was dead. I felt them move me. I knew what George had done. Tears were streaming down Bianca's face now. She didn't try to stop them. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't tell anyone. And then I heard your voice. The screen went quiet for a moment. Rob's eyes closed. When they opened again, they were wet. You were the only one who saw me. Bianca reached out, hesitated, then gently placed her hand over Rob's. I almost didn't say anything, she whispered. I almost stayed quiet. But you didn't. Why? Bianca looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd given her a job when she needed one, who'd remembered her daughter's name, who'd paid hospital bills without being asked. This man who'd written her name on a piece of paper and trusted her with his life. Because you saw me too, she said. Rob's eyes closed again. This time, a tear slipped down his cheek. They sat like that for a long time. No words, just presence. Finally, Rob's eyes moved back to the screen. I'm rewriting my will. Bianca started to protest, but he continued. Not just money. A foundation, in your name, for caregivers, for patients who get overlooked, for people the system ignores, people like you. Bianca couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I'm alive because you refuse to be invisible. Now I want to make sure no one else has to be. Later that afternoon, Bianca stood in the hospital parking lot, staring out at the bay. The fog was lifting. The sun was breaking through. The water looked almost blue. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Maya. Mum, everyone at school is talking about you. Are you famous now? Bianca smiled, typed back, No, baby, I'm just your mum. But as she drove home through the streets of Daly City, past the small apartment where she'd raised her daughter alone, past the life she'd built from scraps and second chances, she knew something had changed. Not because of fame, not because of money, but because for the first time in her life, Bianca had spoken up, and the world had listened. 4 months later, Rob Walton stood on his terrace, unsteady, leaning on a cane, but standing. The doctors said it was remarkable, that locked-in syndrome patients rarely regained this much function, that he was lucky. Rob didn't feel lucky. He felt grateful. Below him, the Bay Area stretched out like a promise. San Francisco in the distance, the Golden Gate barely visible through the morning haze. But today, the fog was lifting. Bianca stood beside him, not as an employee, as a friend. She'd left the cleaning business 3 weeks ago, not because she was too good for it, but because she had other work to do now. The Bianca Morrison Foundation launched last month. Offices in Oakland, a staff of 12. A mission to advocate for overlooked caregivers and patients dismissed by the medical system. Already, they'd helped 19 families. 19 people who might have been buried alive metaphorically or literally if someone hadn't fought for them. Rob turned to her. His speech was still slow, still slurred, but getting better. "You know what I learned?" he asked. Bianca waited. "Power means nothing," Rob said, "if no one's brave enough to use it right." Bianca smiled. "And money? Useless, unless it saves lives." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up below them. Rob Walton had built an empire, made billions, shaped skylines. But none of that mattered the day he needed someone to see him, really see him. And the woman who did? She wasn't powerful. She wasn't rich. She wasn't anyone the world would have called important. But that day in St. Augustine's cathedral, Bianca became the only person brave enough to stop death itself. Some people are called heroes because they wear capes. Others are called heroes because they refuse to stay silent. And sometimes, just sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. Because courage doesn't come from power. It comes from knowing that truth matters more than comfort, that lives matter more than appearances, that standing up even when you're shaking is always better than staying quiet. Bianca looked out at the bay, at the fog disappearing, at the light breaking through. "You ready?" Rob asked. She nodded. Together, they walked back inside. Two people who should never have crossed paths. 2 lives saved by one act of courage. And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that your voice matters, that speaking up counts, that one person really can make a difference, then maybe you understand why stories like this need to be shared. Not for fame, not for views, but because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that truth is stronger than silence, that courage is contagious, and that the world changes when ordinary people decide they've had enough. The fog lifts when we stop hiding, and the truth survives when someone's brave enough to speak it. If you love this story, please don't scroll past. Like this video, share these videos to your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I am sharing an amazing story just like this.